practices. We are recording this to make it available to folks later on as well, and we'll redirect you to where we will house this video as well as some other resources at the end of the webinar. So before we get started, we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Erica Saldivar Garcia, and I am a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at NYU Steinhardt. And this is actually the same title that Heather also has, so I'll make sure that she gets that credit as well. And we both teach in the Multilingual Multicultural Studies program, so we cover courses in bilingual education, foreign language education, and TESOL. My area of expertise specifically relates to bilingual students who are typically referred to as heritage language learners. And so I work with a lot of bilingual Latino populations. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Heather so she can introduce herself.
Thanks so much, and welcome to everyone for joining us and for caring so much about your students that you want to learn more. My name is Heather Woodley. I'm a faculty member, like Erica, in the Department of Teaching and Learning. I also co-lead our childhood ed program, which focuses on preparing all teachers to be teachers of multilingual learners. My personal focus, I work a lot with family and community empowerment and integration, creating inclusive and anti-racist classrooms, and working particularly with Arabic-speaking populations. So thank you again so much, and now we're going to learn a little bit about you.
Great, thank you. So at the beginning of the webinar, you should have seen a link to join our Poll Everywhere. And we know that a lot of you are coming from New York. So if you can, please let us know. It looks like we have a couple of people coming from Westchester, some maybe from Rockland, some from Queens. And if you're not from New York, if you can go ahead and reply to the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. I see someone from Pennsylvania, from Auburn, welcome. New Jersey, that's where I'm at right now too.
While we're hearing where you're all from, we also want to bring your attention to a document we put in the chat. We want to make everything that we're sharing accessible to you. So any link that we're referring to throughout the webinar, we've live linked it on a document. You can get the document by clicking directly on the Google Docs link. There's also a tiny URL, a bit.ly URL you can type in, and this way when we refer to a link, you can click on it and see what's up, or you can access it later on for your own use.
Great. We also have some people joining us from Washington Heights, someone from Ontario, California, from Staten Island, from Rockaway Park. Great, thank you all. We're so happy to have you here, and we're so happy that there's people from New York and from other places as well joining us today. So to go ahead and get us started, we'll go ahead and share a little bit about what we'll be doing today. Oh, Heather, you're muted.
We're going to take a minute. I'm going to turn my video off, not because we don't love showing ourselves, but we really want to be able to focus on the words that we're saying and the visuals that we've provided in the screen. So we're here, but you will just be hearing us for a little bit, okay? So let's get started with thinking about our goals for today. Well, first of all, we want to provide educators with actual strategies to engage diverse families in literacy and content development at home through various modalities. And we understand that this is a combination of at-home learning that is part of remote learning, but it's also at-home learning that takes place all the time. Erica and I were concerned about integrating families into learning even before COVID-19, and it has only expanded the need for this. Another goal we have during our time with you is to share examples of family-based activities that address the global COVID-19 pandemic and students' social-emotional learning as well. And how are we going to get there?
Great question, thank you. So we are going to do a couple of things today. We're going to start off by introducing the framework that we'll use for our webinar today, which will include a couple of theories that focus on family engagement specifically and literacy as well. Then we'll dive into specific strategies focused on family literacy and how that can also be modified to remote instruction, as well as just your regular day-to-day activities in your home. And then finally, we'll transition into a more in-depth example of a unit that showcases what trauma-informed pedagogy can look like in a remote learning setting. So that'll be a little bit towards the end. And finally, we'll end with an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we'll stick around and answer some of those, as well as sharing a couple more resources. So with that, I'll switch it back to Heather.
So we want to share with you some of our frameworks, some of the literature and research that really informs what we're talking about in the way that we approach teaching and teacher education. Our first bit of framework is thinking about translanguaging pedagogies. And this comes from the work of Ophelia Garcia. So what does it mean to really build on students' whole linguistic repertoires? What does it mean to integrate home language regardless of a teacher's own personal language practices and make space for home language in dynamic and multimodal ways? We're also looking at a theory of funds of knowledge. So how are we taking the funds of knowledge, the expertise of communities and families, and integrating that into meaningful ways into content and curriculum? And we also have a framework of culturally sustaining pedagogies. Now, many of you have heard about things like culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive. Now, this framework coming from Django Paris focuses deeper on pedagogy that isn't just relevant to students' culture, but actually seeks to sustain it, that seeks to empower it and enliven it.
We will also be drawing on a framework of literacy as dynamic. And what we mean by literacy as dynamic is we're thinking beyond just the acts of reading and writing, and we're really starting to dive into what does it mean for a child or a student to be reading and writing the world as they engage through it in an active process. That's not necessarily tied down to just reading and writing, but also incorporates things like multimodal interaction with text in ways that expand beyond those traditional norms. We're also going to be drawing on trauma-informed pedagogies, and here we're really targeting the areas of child and human development that rely on fomenting a sense of connectedness, safety, and self as you engage in the world, particularly during this challenging time where we are experiencing multiple national and international level broader themes that we'll discuss a little bit later, and particularly the COVID-19 that's plaguing the whole world right now. So we'll transition into talking about some of those strategies. So Heather will dive into family literacies and then how to develop those in the content areas during remote instruction.
Thank you. So what we're going to see on our first slide here is really thinking about strategies for supporting families to work with their children and make literacy part of every day. Now, the first idea that we have here is that literacy is everywhere. So much of the way that families are approached when it comes to integrating learning is often laden with a lot of assumptions. So I'm actually going to draw your attention first to this speech bubble. These are questions to find out about families' diverse literacy practices. And I'm sure a lot of us know about that kind of first week of school survey where parents and family members are asked questions like, how often do you read with your child? Or what kind of stories do you read at bedtime? Now, these questions are just full of culturally embedded assumptions. First of all, literacy is much more than reading. Storytelling comes in all forms, and for our multilingual learners and their families, literacy development is about honoring the various multimodal forms of storytelling. And also, this idea that everybody curls up with a book at the end of the day in bed is also very much a cultural norm based on white middle-class values. So how are we going beyond that to thinking about so many different ways of storytelling? We have some questions here as examples to share with families to get a deeper picture of how they are experiencing literacy. It also makes it so families don't have to say things like 0 hours or we don't read. It can be really difficult for families to engage with surveys where they have to admit to something they're not doing. These questions then are much more open and allow for multiple ways of storytelling. We have examples here of how literacy is everywhere. all of the transferable literacy skills can be done with shows and movies, multilingual podcasts, music and song analysis, storytelling, whether it's folk tales or family stories, family interviews. Imaginary play is a big part of literacy development, as well as visual arts and pictures as texts. In our next slide, we're going to look at some of this a little more in depth. Okay, so looking at this idea of multimodal reading together. So as we know, it is a huge push that we are asking families to read together. But what that looks like can be very different depending on families' linguistics, families' literacy engagement, availability of books, availability of technology, and we really can't be making assumptions that any of these are readily available or not readily available to a family. So these are some ideas for multimodal reading together. First of all, we have 2 links here that go to online libraries, and this is not your typical library. The pictures at the bottom are actually screenshots from them. First, there's Discussing Race with Children, a virtual library, and a Black Lives Matter interactive library. So the texts from these libraries are available in English and Spanish, and when you click on a book, it actually brings you to a read aloud of the book. This enables families to listen to it, to see the words, and possibly to have a text in front of them if that's possible. What it doesn't do, it doesn't assume parents' English literacy ability, and it doesn't assume that reading together means that the parent or the child has to be the one actually decoding the book. You can read together while watching a video of a read aloud. That is still reading together. Next, we have a link here to Thornwood Elementary School. It's a school in Canada that has created an amazing dual language showcase. These are the 2 screenshots you see on the right. They're side-by-side bilingual texts created by children and families. So they are in children's voice, they are vetted by community members, and they are a wonderful way for families to read together and also to use as mentor texts. So you can ask your families to create collaboratively this idea of a side-by-side bilingual book. And the last idea we have here is community created audiobooks. So if you have a text that you are assigning to your students, how can you tap into the bilingualism or multilingualism of your community to create multilingual audio versions of the English text you're reading? So if I send all of my kids home with a book, can I get somebody to record themselves reading it in Bengali and Spanish and Arabic and Mandarin? So then families can simultaneously read the book in English while listening to it in their home language. So these are just some ways that students and families can engage with multimodal reading, and also thinking about what does it mean to read and engage with stories. So we're going to go to the next slide to look at some other examples of family literacy. And here we have some family guides and stop points. So this is based on our idea that literacy skills are absolutely transferable. In other words, if you can identify the author's purpose in a film, you can probably identify the author's purpose in a short reading. If you can explain characterization from a television show, you can explain characterization from a book you read. So it's really important that we as teachers and educators make this clear to families, that you can sit down and watch a TV show and still talk to your kid about character, setting, plot, all of these literary ideas, and it is still helping them develop their literacy skills. This is a huge door opener for a lot of our families who feel that their home language is holding them back, when we want them to feel that their home language is bringing them forward, and also helps families who might be on various levels of literacy to still engage with students' literacy development. So the links we have here, one is from the Reading Tree. It's a project of the Vancouver Library, and it provides reading tips in home languages for families. So it talks about use of voice and when to stop and things to talk about. This idea of where do we stop in a book and ask kids questions comes really naturally to a lot of us as teachers, but not necessarily to all families. And secondly, we have some read aloud tips for families. Here are guides in English and Spanish from an organization called Start with a Book. And these are really great because they give specific ideas for reading wordless picture books, audio books, and ebooks, because they are different experiences. And for a lot of our families, they might be relying right now more on ebooks or audiobooks. And the way that we engage with them or we read them with our children might look different. So these guides can be really helpful. I urge you, if you're sharing these with families, consider getting them even more translated into other languages. And also, if you feel that the families you're working with will not necessarily read this, there's nothing to say that you can't take a tip sheet and record yourself reading it out loud and send that video memo to parents and families. That's a great way to really increase accessibility of information and accessibility of so many of these resources. So now we're going to look at our next topic, and that is family math and science. Again, thinking about how math and science are everywhere, and some questions we can ask to get to know the math and science practices of our families. So asking them things like, how do they measure or weigh things? Different activities that happen at home, whether it's working with money or cooking or sewing, being in nature, looking at shapes, animals, building and construction, and health and body. So really tapping into these funds of knowledge that are so prevalent in everyday life. We're going to now look at some specific examples. And here is one based on the simple act of cooking. We have found that cooking is one of our great cross-cultural activities, and we really want to build on this to help families understand that you are a valuable teacher in your child's life, even when you're doing something as simple as cooking. So the resources you see here actually come from some products that our students in bilingual education, TESOL and foreign language created, and childhood education, and they are multilingual family cooking activity books. The table of contents is here, and you see some screenshots from our Mandarin and Spanish books. So what we are thinking about is, how are we taking the simple act of cooking and helping families to integrate lessons about everything from ratios to measurement, number and operation practice, something as simple as states of matter. Why is steam rising up from the broccoli? Thinking about chemical reactions. All of these larger scientific ideas can really be integrated really well into something like a daily activity of cooking. I urge you to look at these cookbooks or activity books and think about how they can be used with your families. We're going to look at our next examples of some math and science, specifically focused on measurement and money. So there are so many ways that math is being used throughout all of our multilingual learners' homes. And I mean that in ways that span socioeconomics and culture and language. So first of all, when we're asking students to engage in math tasks of measurement, there are many apps that help us. There's actually a measurement app on the iPhone where you can walk and measure something. But again, we don't want to make assumptions of technology. So how are we helping families to identify hands-on tools? Well, first of all, the idea that every home has a ruler is a huge assumption. However, they might be sewing and have measuring tape. They might have other tools. So it's really important that we ask our families, how do they engage in measuring or weighing things, so we can kind of get an inventory about the tools that they are using. There's great lessons we can think about with metric system comparisons. A lot of our families coming from outside the US, this idea of pounds and inches, we're going to need some cross-cultural comparison and understanding. Issues of currency and money exchange, imaginary play, such as playing store and restaurant, budgeting, spending and saving, sewing, arts and crafts, origami, and paper airplanes, all have great potential for family integrated math and science. So we're going to look at some of these in depth. All right, so thinking about building and construction. If you're anything like me with my two children, you know about the world of Legos and Duplo and blocks in general. And this is a wonderful gateway into math and science, but can also be scaffolded up for older learners. 18-year-olds can get so much about science and engineering through Legos. So thinking about shape, identification, and relationships, the language of sequence of events. And we have a link here for you for multilingual content area glossaries. So this link is going to take you to an entire library of glossaries, and there's the screenshot at the bottom, that are side-by-side translated based on content areas and grade level. Sharing these with families is a huge step. It enables family members and parents to acknowledge that they know a lot of content. They might just not have the English word for it. So this really opens the doors for families being able to engage with the learning, but also to strengthen their own child's home language. So if they're learning about shapes in English, how are they helping their child to understand the terminology for that in their home language? Now, considering it's getting hot and we're heading for summer, we wanted to share some ideas for water play. So water play is full of opportunities for family integrated science, whether it's measurement, states of matter, environmental science, or working with descriptive language. We really want to think about these ways of integrating content learning with play, but also giving families the resources and the language to talk about it with their children. So how are they able to help their children with descriptive language or with issues of measurement? And again, this is something that parents and family members of all linguistic levels and literacy levels can engage with. And I'm just going to right now put one more reminder in the chat because I've seen some people join us now. I'm just going to share again the link that will bring you to the list of live links that we are referring to constantly. So I'm going to turn it over now to Erica, who's going to share some wonderful, robust examples of trauma-informed pedagogy during COVID-19.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you for those wonderful resources you shared with all of us. One of the things that has obviously been on top of all of our minds as we start to hear new plans for the fall semester and as school districts and departments of education start to make decisions about what instruction will look like when we return to school or as the school year winds down is how am I going to, one, adjust to remote instruction, but then also how am I going to acknowledge the global pandemic and everything that's going on in the world? So just before we get started, I do want to say that the unit that I will share with you today was actually crafted and at the middle of March till like beginning of April. So a lot of the more recent national discussions and international discussions that we've been having about Black Lives Matter were not as prominent then. So that's the reason that they're not addressed directly in this unit that I will be sharing with you today. But I did want to just take a moment to acknowledge that that is something that is happening and that we should address that by all means in our teaching. So to get us started, I actually want us to think about some of the ways that we've been promoting connectedness with our students. So going back to our poll everywhere, the link is also in the chat. If you have your computer, you can open up another tab and share some of the ways in which you or your school have promoted connectedness with your students during the pandemic. And if you don't have access to either of those, please feel free to share in the chat as well, if there are any ways in which you've promoted connectedness. Show and tell during Zoom calls, yes. That's a great way. Everyone says hello in their home language. Yes, absolutely. Conversaciones comunitarias. Yeah, absolutely. And engaging in conversations with communities are fantastic ways to encourage students to feel connected. Students have a pen pal in the class. That's a wonderful way for students to feel connected to each other as well. Providing talking points, absolutely. Another wonderful way to encourage students to feel connected. So keep these poll everywhere links handy. We'll come back and do one more before the end of the webinar. For now, I'll go ahead and turn over and thinking about why trauma-informed pedagogy. So really when we consider that as human beings, we have this natural tendency to want to feel safe, to feel connected, and we also want to feel hopeful in the world. We're not necessarily saying that the coronavirus pandemic has been traumatizing, but what we're saying is that there is a potential for students to have reactions to it based on the simple fact that it is disrupting their everyday lives. It is disrupting the systems and the routines that they have in place in order to interact with other human beings, with other people of their own age. And all of those things need time in order for them to process them, in order for them to really understand what's going on, and for them to really think deeply about how this is changing the world around them. And this is particularly important for some of our students who are also students of color. We know that the COVID-19 has disproportionately affected Black communities throughout the United States. We also know that students are dealing with illness and death. They might have experienced it by observing it in their communities, or someone that they know might have been impacted. For our Asian students, we also want to make sure that we acknowledge all of the anti-racism that has all of a sudden risen up as a result of the virus. There's, a lot of loss of routine, friendships in school, relationships. And then again, these aren't isolated events. They're all intersectional, and, they're all working together at the same time. You can also think about things like family loss of jobs or inability to travel. All of those are disruptions to students' lives that we want to help them process. So the quote that is up here comes from a text on collective cultural trauma. And here really it's the idea that trauma can also emerge at the level of collectivity in an entire society. And so if you're interested in reading a little bit further about trauma and grief resources and what that might look like in classroom teaching, there's a couple of links here that are also included in the document that talk a little bit more about trauma-informed pedagogy and some recommendations or priorities that you can take into your teaching as you start to think about the fall, but also now as you start to wrap up the year for those folks that are on the East Coast. So this was a concern that me and one of my collaborative teachers had. And we started these conversations thinking, well, what can we do in a foreign language classroom in order to help students process everything that they're experiencing, but also help them process, why language learning might still be relevant in such a global and national context. So in our conversations, we said, if we had to prioritize anything in the classroom at this point, even in a second language classroom, it would be focusing on fostering a feeling of hope, safety, and connectedness. So as we were thinking about developing instruction, we prioritized these 3 different parameters, and I'll explain how we went ahead and developed an entire unit focused on helping students in the target language process these. So my collaborating teacher, I do want to give her a huge shout out. Her name is Melanie Manuel, and she teaches at the American School in London in the United Kingdom. So, we were thinking about this topic, and like many teachers, she also had a unit that she still had to teach based on the curricular sequence of where she was in her school year. So at that time, she was thinking of reframing a unit on pasatiempos y la ciudad. So leisure and city environments isn't necessarily something that students were thinking about as probably the most important things in their life, considering the many disruptions that they were experiencing. So the task for us became, how can we design a unit that touches upon leisure and leisure activities and the city, but engages students in a way that makes everything that they're experiencing and feeling relevant in the second language classroom. So we use the framework of understanding by design to really target this broader understanding of making sense of the pandemic. So the essential questions that we developed were, 1, how does the current situation make me feel? 2, how can we take care of ourselves during this time? And how can we stay connected to others from a distance? We also wanted students to think about signs, music, art, and social media as a way to lift up their spirits and inform others of what they may be experiencing and different events going on. And then the last essential question that we had was, what do I hope to do / where do I hope to go when the lockdown ends? So the unit was implemented in a 6th grade classroom. So we have students ages 11 to 12. I think there was one that was 13, in the context of a Spanish as a foreign language classroom. And I will say, even though I'm focusing on Spanish here, this unit is very easily modifiable to an English context or to teaching any other language, really. So using these questions, we designed many activities, but today I'm going to highlight those that relate to hope, connectedness, and safety. So I'll show you examples of what that looked like. So as we were starting to think about hope, we were thinking about what hope was looking like at a national level. And what we did was we started to notice all these pictures of rainbows showing up on social media, showing up all around the world, and almost every aspect of discussions regarding the pandemic. We were seeing these rainbows as a symbol of hope. So because the target language was Spanish here, we asked our students to take a look at different rainbows that were representative or that were being originated from Spanish-speaking countries. So all of these were found online. We had students looking at different social media websites like Twitter, Instagram, or other places where they might find sharing of images. What we did in the classroom, or I should say Melanie did, I was only observing, Melanie guided the students through conversations thinking about, what is it that people are highlighting in their rainbows? What are people saying about them? And how are they different from the ones that I might see during my walks around the community with my parents? Or are they similar to the ones that I'm seeing in my neighbor's house? Or are there even any? Became questions that students started to bring up in the classroom. So as we started to have these conversations, students felt really inspired to create their own rainbows. And here are just some examples of what that looked like. So you can see here that students started to say, todo va a salir bien, edúcate, quédate en casa. Quédate en casa was one that came up a lot, but todo va a salir bien, yo me quedo en casa. Cuídate mucho. So take care of yourself. Everything's going to be well. Everything's going to turn out okay, as a form of, inspiring hope. So students actually created these. We had multiple sessions online where students got together and drafted and had conversations with each other about what they might want to include in these rainbow images. And then they created them and shared them with each other. And eventually these went up on their windows. So, even though this was something that we did for a unit and an instructional setting, this is something that parents and families could also do with their students at home or with their children at home as a way to help them feel more hopeful during the lockdown experience. So the second part of our unit that we really wanted to emphasize was a feeling of safety. And it's hard to tell students that they're going to be safe or that everyone that they know will be safe in a context where conversations regarding death and conversations regarding, the shortages of supplies that may be going on in the medical field are very prominent. So one of the ways that we came up with was also using digital literacy. So we looked across social media. We were looking to see, so what are countries doing as a way to reach out to children, and how may that be helpful in our classroom? So we found that there were a lot of places that were starting to develop superheroes as a way to help children feel somehow connected to everything that was going on, but also to encourage them to stay home and to get a better understanding of what was going on. So the first superhero we found was actually Susana Distancia, which is up here on the left corner. Susana Distancia was created by the Mexican government as a way to incentivize or encourage people, specifically children, to stay at home. So as a class, and mind you, these students are in a Spanish level 1 equivalent of what you might teach in the US as a high school unit level 1. So they don't have all of the knowledge in order to linguistic knowledge to really decipher what that might mean. But we looked at images, we walked them through different activities so that they could understand the message and the meaning of Susana Distancia, even though they didn't have necessarily the linguistic access to reading all of the text. What we did then is similar to before, where we had the students engaged in digital literacy, so looking across the internet to find different examples of the rainbows. We had them use those similar tools to look for different examples of superheroes that were coming up. What this did was it allowed them to really, one, find the superheroes, which is a really fun activity in general, but then it also allowed them to really think about, well, who are the superheroes that are emerging across countries and across contexts? So you see that, in the bottom right, there's the great doctor without fear. And then, so this is a series actually of comics that came up. And later on, there was, superheroes de supermercados. So the superheroes that are in the grocery stores, right? So having students really think about who's delivering our groceries, who are the people that are going out there and helping us, have nourishment and continue to provide food for us, which led into more in-depth conversations regarding agriculture and where our food comes from, et cetera. But it really helped. This really opened up a window of opportunity for them to think about culture in a way that was a little bit more expansive beyond the classroom. So the activity that came from this after this exploration for students was one where we had them create sidekicks for the superheroes. So here are just a couple of my favorites that I thought were particularly genius, and the alliteration is definitely clear. So we have Mujer Máscara, Todo va a salir bien. We have Sara Sanitaria, practica la distancia social, puedes aprender algo nuevo como cocinar, dibujar y mucho más. So Sana Sanitaria is not just telling us to stay home, but she's giving us suggestions of what we could do at home. We have Paco Pandemia, who says, yo me quedo en casa, I will stay home. And then finally, on the top right, we have Carlos Corona, who is displaying his love for all the essential workers that are out there in the world. The third dimension that we wanted to focus on was connectedness. And so this really manifested itself across all of the activities, but a couple in particular that I want to highlight. So the first thing we wanted to do was to continue to encourage a connection with societies. So really, the first thing that we did as we were starting to develop the unit was brainstorm ways in which students could continue to interact with the target language in a way that felt meaningful for them in the current situation. So one of the activities that we introduced the unit with was having students watch drawing YouTube videos in the target language. So they were still listening to Spanish speakers, but they were actually being guided in drawing images. So at the top left, you see un ojo y un corazón, a heart and an eye, that students drew as a result of watching a tutorial on YouTube. We also wanted them to develop, to continue to think about their connection to self and really process how they were feeling. And so here we recycled some of the vocabulary and some of the themes that the students had already covered in a previous unit by allowing them to describe how they were feeling. So you see here in the top right, a veces me siento perezosa porque no tengo nada para hacer y me quedo en casa. So sometimes I feel a little lazy because I don't have anything to do and I'm staying at home. And then, the student goes on to say, otros días me siento fuerte y bien porque hago ejercicio en mi dormitorio. There's other days that I feel strong and I feel good because I exercise in my room. Another way we had them connect to themselves and to their feelings was by thinking about all the things that they would remember from quarantine. So the flower that you see on the bottom, on the middle right, is students, talking about things that they might remember. So phrases such as cuídate mucho, take care of yourself a lot, classes in Zoom, cocinar con mis hermanas. So, just like Heather referred to earlier, cooking is something that's so important, but here it's also being highlighted as something that students are making a direct connection. Like, this is something I will remember moving forward. Dibujar en mi dormitorio, aprender una canción en mi ukulele. The student had time to finally learn a song on her ukulele, and that was something she wanted to remember. We also wanted students to feel connected to families and to their friends, even though they couldn't see them. So we started thinking about, well, what can be a way for them to encourage that? So we had them create poems. And here you can see that in the poem that the student wrote in the middle left, there's a description of the people, the places, and things that they missed during quarantine. what we found is that having these conversations as the students were writing these poems was really helpful because it allowed them to really reflect on a lot of the taken for granted things in their everyday life that they were all of a sudden feeling really nostalgic about. And then, we didn't want the students to just think about the past or about what their life was like before the quarantine or what it was like during the quarantine, but we also wanted them to think about what it might be like coming out of the quarantine and how their life might change. So we actually had students create action plans that described what that process and what that change might look like. So we have, if you look at the bottom, going across from left to right, the student is describing a normal day before quarantine. So here she's talking about the time she spent with her friends, swimming, going to church, going to the movies, going to restaurants, going to the park, etc. And then in the center, she's talking about what's going on during quarantine. How have those same activities been altered because of their lockdown restrictions? And then finally, on the right-hand side, you have the student thinking about, well, what am I going to do once lockdown ends? And how might that be related to what I'm experiencing now? And how is it different from my expectations prior? The twist on language here is that we actually were using a lot of the verbs and irregular verbs that are part of the id construction in Spanish, so to go, that was already part of our unit thinking about the city, but we modified it to make it relevant for them in their current situation. So in this way, we were able to sort of target and hit upon leisure activities, and we were also able to help students experience their own city and cities across the world through the lens of their current reality. So we altered the curriculum to some sense, but we were able to keep all of the big nuts and bolts that were necessary for them to progress onto the next level. So I know we just covered a lot of information, and we will provide an opportunity for you to ask questions, but as a way to sort of sum up, I want us to think about, Heather presented us a lot of different strategies, and then I just gave you a whole different example of a unit that you might integrate into your classroom, just based on all of the activities that you heard about. What is one way you will connect your teaching to families? And if you don't have access to the poll everywhere, feel free to include your comments in the chat as well. Ooh, math and sewing. I know a lot of our moms make their own clothes. Yes, my mom actually made a lot of my clothes growing up, and I learned a lot of math through that process of just observing her. Reading books in native language. Yes, absolutely. There's so many opportunities to continue learning languages. Talk about characters in a telenovela. There's so much that can be done there. So much that can be done. And like Heather said, if you can talk about character characteristics from a movie, you can certainly talk about them in a book when you encounter them as well. I see in the chat sharing recipes and even live cooking videos. Yes, it's actually something that we do a lot in foreign language education, but you can do that all across the age levels, right? With the assistance of an adult, you can do so many things. Change the way I ask questions in the parent survey. That is a huge one, and a lot of the assumptions that come along with, some of the questions that we're used to asking. Gaming and dancing, yes, that's a wonderful way as well. Asking students to show what they typically do when they're not in school. Wonderful, wonderful, and key way to include some of those funds of knowledges that we referred to earlier. Ask students to show a dance, yes. And these have particularly become really popular with the advent of TikTok and a lot of different social media, so kudos to that one. Analyze language and music they listen to, absolutely. More than ever, students are probably also tinkering with creating their own videos, so thinking about their own music, so thinking about the processes that go into that. Fantastic. Ask students to teach how they say I am friendly in their native language or a cool sentence. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things there too is to as far as it comes to, thinking about the pandemic and everything that they're processing, is what sort of language might they need in order to express some of, these concepts, to make them relevant, so that when they start to talk to their friends, they're like, oh yeah, like this is what I did, or this is what I'm looking forward to. Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of these. I'm going to turn it back to Heather to help us close out our webinar and then transition into our question and answer.
As we're moving on to the next slide, I just want to shout out the last suggestion that was made in the chat: guide families using laundry time as a teachable moment. I don't think I've ever done more laundry than I've done in the last 3 months. And this is an amazing entry point into everything from chemistry to math to household duties. So that is a great suggestion. Thank you so much, Monique. So we're going to go to our next slide to look at some of the resources we shared with you. We want to give respect to the resources we drew on for thinking about our frameworks. So here are some great resources for you if you want to look deeper into the literature or research that informs a lot of the ideas we've been talking about today. On our next slide are links. These are also all available on the Google Doc that you got the link to, and our little bit.ly right there. The first one we have are translanguaging guides from CUNY NYSIB. These are wonderful, free, full guide books that go through translanguaging strategies that can be applied to all content areas, all grade levels, and all levels of learners. So they help you think about how are you infusing home language research in your class, or multilingual writing partners, and in very multimodal ways. So check that out. They also have great resources for different subgroups. During Erica's portion, we actually got a Q&A question. So thank you so much to who shared that. And their question was looking for resources specifically for early childhood, for the pre-K or even preschool population. CUNY NYSIB has some great resources that specifically speak to early childhood education, to newcomers, to students labeled long-term Ls, to students labeled SIFE. So I really encourage you to check them out for so many free things. There's also a link here to understood.org. We didn't specifically talk about it, but we really want to make it clear that all of the strategies that we're talking about today take into account students' learning differences and can be very meaningful for students with IEPs. We're sharing this resource here because from our experience as educators, this is one of the best resources to share with parents of learners with IEPs. It really breaks down concepts like accommodations or modifications, or what does it mean to teach and learn with a learning disability. Another resource we've shared here are some audiobooks in Spanish. The next site, Community and School Resources for Remote Learning, is our NYU site, where we are sharing things like the Multilingual Family Cookbook activity book and other read-alouds and printable activities and resources that are specifically made for learning at home. And our last link there is Families for Radical Education Empowerment. This is a site put together by faculty who are simultaneously parents and educators. There are curated lists of book lists. I know there's a lot of book lists floating around social media right now. They're all compiled in one place here for you. There are media lists and social media suggestions and lots of different ideas for bridging this gap between families and educators. And lastly, you have our email addresses because we are resources. We love to continue the conversation and think about how we can all better support and meet the needs of our multilingual learners and their families. So we want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, for being an educator, for caring about this population, and we really appreciate it. So we're going to actually open the floor to some questions. And thank you for anyone who typed in thank you. It was anonymous, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Andrea. It was great to have you. Thank you, Catherine. It was great to have you as well. Thanks, Anna. It was great to have you with us.
And we're also going to send you a friendly reminder that you can join New York State TESOL on their website. So it's a great organization that works really nicely to bridge these gaps between families and educators and research and practice. So we're really happy to bring this to you. And feel free to share this with your schools too. This can be a great kind of welcome back to school professional development. You as language educators are often what all those gen ed teachers come to with questions. So we hope that this can serve as a resource for you to share with the rest of your school community.
Absolutely. We also recorded the webinar, so we will share this with you as our participants so that you can take a look at it if you want to look back at some of the resources and conversations we had as well.
So we have a great question here. Can there be additional resources gathered for another webinar or document compiling resources for Black Lives Matter or race, even race in terms of Spanish-speaking countries? So Eric and I have been working a lot with this issue, thinking about colorism in communities or even different terms for race and color in home languages and helping families investigate with that. We don't have another webinar planned right now. We did share 2 interactive libraries specifically geared towards talking about race and Black Lives Matter, but this is a really important issue and we're really happy to continue this. If you're not already the part of AERA, the Bilingual Education Research SIG on Facebook has some wonderful resources, and they actually have a social justice resources in Spanish link. If I can find it in enough time to add it to the chat, I'm going to do that right now. But I urge you to join them as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, we can even add a couple of them onto the resources document that we shared with you. We can add a couple more of just like Facebook sites you can join to hear a little bit more about some of the resources that are being developed. Great question. I don't see any more questions, so we will share. Oh, actually, I think.
Oh, I just put a link in the chat. This is anti-racism resources, specifically in Spanish, if you'd like to access that.
Perfect. Great. And yes, Danette, we will share the video of it with all of the registrants so you have it available to look back onto. Great, thank you all so much for joining us. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat right now. You will get this presentation, you do have our email, so if any other questions do arise, please feel free to reach out. Like Heather said, we are resources for you as well.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.